Okay, so from this point, the class is being recorded. And I don't know, let's activate subtitles. Let's see how that works, if it helps at all. So we were talking about referring and denoting, how those two concepts are very crucial to the understanding of how we relate meaning with the real world, right? We said that referring and denoting are two of those concepts that allow people to talk about the world. So how does that work? We said that there was a difference between referring and denoting, that even though both of them were kind of similar, they have huge differences in terms of how they work. We said, and this is something I already gave you in the presentations in the class, so I'm going to skip it for the moment. This is more or less what we talked in class. We talked about the difference between denotation and reference, and we said that denotation is basically a property of words. It's independent from language in use or context. It is very much depending on the literal meaning of the words. It depends basically on the properties of the words, what the properties talk about in a more regular way, and not depending on how the speaker uses the expression. That's denotation. In denotation, we don't care very much about what the speaker means or what his intentions are. We just focus on the expression itself, the linguistic expression. I mean, the word or the sentence or the phrase, and we try to figure out what that phrase or sentence is trying to talk about or what it's trying to connect with in the world. On the other hand, we said that reference is an action of the speaker, right? Reference is an action of the speaker, which is different from denotation, which is only a property of words. So since reference is an action of the speaker, it relates on or it depends on speaker meaning, right? And we say that it is much more unstable because it depends on context. Reference is very much related to context. So let's see. Yes, it's very much related to context. So those will be the more basic differences between reference and denotation. All right. So moving on. Okay, you say you cannot see the slides. Valentina, is it a problem for everyone? Okay, so maybe it's a problem. It's a problem for you there, Valentina. I'm sorry.
Professor,
Yep.
sorry, can you start again with the presentation, like the compartir pantalla? It's because some classmates start to share the screen, and that's the reason why we can't see your presentation, your slides.
You start to share the screen? What do you mean?
Yes, but another classmate started to present the screen, so that's the reason why we can't see your slides, because another classmates they like share their screen, so
All
you
right, so
understand.
I'm gonna stop sharing and
Pero es que la
stop and start
presentación está
again.
en una esquina, tienen que fijarla ustedes mismos y ya.
All right, so I'm gonna do it again. Start with the presentation.
La presentación está en la esquina superior derecha. Ahí le dan
Tienen que,
clic y ya.
tienen que fijarla ustedes mismos y ya aparece.
Okay, so I'm going to show you my screen for the moment. You have to look for the presentation about here. Let's see if you can see that about here. The presentation should be here and you should click on it, and I don't know, that way it's going to be there on your screens. I believe that's the way it should be done. So again, I'm going to stop presenting the screen and I'm going to go back to the presentation. Okay, I am back on the presentation right now. The question is, have you solved the problem? Is the presentation there?
Yes, thank you, Professor.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to go back for just a second to here. We have not moved a lot, thankfully. We're here still. We said that from the beginning that the last concepts that we talked about in class were repairing and denoting. We said that both of those are concepts that describe the relationship between language and the world, but in different ways, right? So we say, moving on in the slide, that denotation is a property of words independent from language in context. And on the other hand, and I forgot to put it here, is that reference is very much related to context. It depends on context, actually. So it's not like, let's see how good I can do this. Like context. Oh my God, this is beautiful. Like a 5-year-old. All right, so reference is very much related to context in that sense, very much related to context. It depends on context, right? Different from denotation. Denotation does not depend on context because denotation talks about the properties of the words themselves, just what the words can connect to in the world, right? Yeah, just like the toads, just as beautiful. All right, so moving on. Bueno, aquí vamos a cambiar el código un momento a español. Entonces, si por lo menos, por ejemplo, si vemos esta frase, ese tipo es un perro, ¿sí? Entonces, la denotación de la palabra perro en este caso, la denotación, su significado literal, su significado estable, se referiría a esta entidad de acá, ¿cierto? Se referiría a esta entidad de acá, ¿cierto? A este animal, 4 patas, es canino, ¿cierto? En ese caso, esa sería la denotación del objeto, pero normalmente si uno usa esta frase, se estaría refiriendo, digamos, a una persona de este calibre, ¿cierto? Pero esto ya sería referencia. ¿Por qué referencia? Porque depende del uso particular del hablante, depende del contexto, ¿sí? Entonces, es más allá, es una acción de la persona en que está tratando de conectarse a un objeto particular del mundo. Eso es referencia. Diferente a la denotación. La denotación que sería independiente de lo que esa persona quiere dar a entender. Pues digamos, en un contexto en el que hay un hombre que está engañando a una muchacha, entonces dice, ese tipo es un perro, Independientemente de la intención de la persona en usar la palabra perro para referirse a un hombre no, que comete infidelidades, independientemente de esa intención, la palabra perro ya lleva una denotación, que es el animal, ¿sí? Que al mismo tiempo esa denotación nos ayuda a conectarlo con las características de un hombre que es perro, pero pues bueno, eso ya es para otras discusiones. Lo que podemos decir es que perro lleva una denotación, un significado estable, literal, y la expresión usada en contexto con la intención del hablante se conecta a otra entidad en el mundo, ¿sí? Y eso ya es dependiente del hablante, de cómo el hablante usa la expresión y para qué propósitos. All right. I know that we saw this topic a few weeks ago. I mean, I think it's already 2 weeks more or less. So if you have any questions by this point, I don't know, ask them in the chat and see what you have. Okay, no questions, no question whatsoever on this part, that's okay. This part is supposed to be quite easy. So moving on. Okay, we talked about this. We said that the referential theory of meaning. We said that we said that talking about reference and denotation was important because we need in semantics to at least handle the topic of meaning. If we say that we are studying meaning in language, at least we need to account for an idea of what we believe meaning is. We need to at least have an idea of what meaning is. So in linguistics, at least, we have two different approaches to what is meaning. Those two different approaches are the referential theory or denotational approach, which stipulates or states that meaning basically is reference. That means meaning is basically the object in the world. But again, this is something we already talked about, and I already showed you this slide, so I'm gonna kind of move from here. So we said that there is another approach, which is the referential approach, which is not based on the real objects in the world, but in our mental representations of those entities, right? Not so much the real object in the world, but the mental representation that we have of the entity, of the action, of the person, of the animal, etc. All right. So the author gives the example of the cold. You have a cold. We say that in English we represent, or the mental representation is that I have the cold. That in some other languages the cold has you. If we see it from reference, then a cold is just this. It's just a mixture of symptoms, right? That's just what the cold is. If we see it from the referential theory of meaning, but from the representational, it is our mental structures. Okay, so we're going to see this again. We can see these two approaches as focusing on different aspects of the same process, talking about the world, etc. In referential theories, meaning derives from language being attached to or grounded in reality. You see, the real world. Meaning from the referential theory is the entities in the real world. But on the other hand, in representational approaches, meaning derives from language being a reflection of our conceptual structures. This is going to be kind of, I don't know, important in the future, but not quite, because linguistics, even though in linguistics we take the terms concepts, conceptual structures, we are not concerned so much in linguistics as what is a concept. We don't care so much because that is, for some linguists, that is more of an obstacle, because that's more from the field of psychology or philosophy to try to figure out what a concept is. So that's why in linguistics we don't care so much about what a concept is. We just know that a concept is something mental, right? But we're not going to focus too much on what a concept looks like or its characteristics. That's not so important or crucial. Okay, moving on. All right. There are some questions that derive from this difference between referential theory and representational theory of meaning. Right? We need to analyze the different ways that a linguistic expression can be used to refer, and some of those limitations, because there are limitations to this. We need to think about if reference is all of meaning, or if there are more aspects to this question. And we need to figure out how reference relies on conceptual knowledge. When we say conceptual knowledge, it means concepts basically. Reference relies on concepts, but we're going to see this in much more detail in the future. So I'm not going to stop for too long on this section because we kind of already mentioned it in the classroom. All right, we talked about this in the classroom. We said that the reference uses nouns and noun phrases, which we call nominals, that we have referring and non-referring expressions, that we have constant versus variable reference, and that we have reference and extensions. So about referring and non-referring expressions, remember that there are some cases where you use language in order to connect with something in the world specifically, and there are some cases where you speak in a more general way and you're not trying to connect to anything in the world. So for example, the author gives the example of I don't know, an exam, which I'm not going to try to pronounce at this moment. Let's say that he's talking about I don't know, a colonoscopy, okay, which is not the example he gives in the book. But let's say he's trying to talk about a colonoscopy because that's much more easy to pronounce. So if I say a colonoscopy is a procedure that tries to identify diseases in the colon, right, on the bowels, in the intestines, right? When I say a colonoscopy, in that case, I am not using a referring expression because I am not trying to connect with anything specific in the world. But if I say the colonoscopy or my father's colonoscopy was okay, I am trying to connect my father's colonoscopy to something very specific that already happened. In that case, I am using colonoscopy as a referring expression. I hope that you remember a little bit of this. We already talked about constant versus variable reference, so we're not going to stop there for too long. We say that reference can be variable most of the times. Most of the times, reference are variable. For example, when I say my hand, right? The expression my hand can change the referent depending on every person that speaks the expression, right? If every one of you says my hand, the reference is going to be different for each and every one of us, right? So that means that the reference is variable. And there are some expressions that can be constant. For example, I don't know, very known expressions for everyone like the moon or the sun or names of cities like Paris. But as I mentioned in the classroom too, that can also be variable depending on the use of the speaker. All right. So moving on, we say that the term extension of an expression is a set of things which could possibly be the referent of that expression. And on this part is where I did the drawing of the toads, right? And I said that if I say toads, the word toad is going to connect by denotation to all the elements in the world that can be denominated as toads. That's basically what it is. Here is where we stopped in the class. We didn't move on any further, which is names. Names from the description theory, it's a label or a shorthand for knowledge about the referent or the right description, or we can discuss names from a causal theory, which is the social knowledge in the use of names. Names are socially inherited or borrowed. Now we can discuss a little bit about names. Okay, names are other expressions that we can use for reference or to pick out elements in the world, mostly people. So names are elements that we can use to refer to entities in the world, mostly people. All right, so let's see some of that. So we say approaching names from a description theory, right? A name as a vehicle for the right description. And for this one, I want to ask a question. Let's see I don't know, who's here? Who's going to be lucky enough? Okay, I want to talk to Leslie. Leslie, are you there? Leslie Joanna?
Yes.
All right, Leslie. My question for you would be to look at the descriptions. Look at the first description, right? Look at this description right here. And I want you to tell me what person am I trying to pick out from the world with this description?
Hitler.
All right, Hitler.
Yeah.
That's good. What is the, and what do you think about the second description? Who am I trying to describe in this case?
The brain strategic instruments, skills. No, I don't. I have no idea.
No idea? All right.
No.
Okay, that's what I was expecting. Thank you so much for your participation. So moving on. So your first guess was correct. Yes, I'm trying to talk about Hitler. But in the second one, I am also talking about Hitler. You see? So in this case, a name acts as a vehicle for the right description. In this case, if I say Hitler, the right description for most people would be this one, right? This will be the right description if I say Hitler, right? But that means that some other knowledge of the person is going to be hidden, right? And let me show you how. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to give you, I don't know, a couple of seconds there to take note of this slide. I'm going to give you a minute there, and then I'll ask you if I can move on, all right? So take a minute there to take your notes. Okay, guys, can I move on? Did you take your notes? All right, so I'm going to suppose you did. So let me show you. Okay, so the first description obviously belongs to this, right? The dictator, the genocide, the genocidal dictator, right? Responsible for the deaths of Jews and the Jewish people. But I don't know if you knew this, but Hitler also kind of loved animals, and he was an artist too. And he was very skilled in painting. But from the description theory of names, a name is just a vehicle for the right description. And in this case, the name Hitler is a connection between the first description of dictator, of evil person, right? In that case, the name is going to connect to that description. And if you don't connect, or better put, if you connect the name with the right description, then you know the referent, you know the person that we're trying to talk about. That is a name. That is what basically a name is from a description theory. And if you don't connect the name with the right description, what happens is what Leslie experienced, that she could not pick out the element in the world. She did not understand, as many of you, I suppose, did not understand when I talked to you about a painter, about an artist, about a mastermind, about an advocate for the animal rights, right? Because in that case, the name Hitler is not a right vehicle for that description. So that's what I mean. Any questions on this section?
No.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let's move on. All right, and now the other side would be a name from a causal theory, which is a name as inherited qualities. And for this one, as a general question for all of you, think about this. We say that a name, or the author says that a name is basically a vehicle for inherited qualities. That when a name gets fame for something, then the person that gets the name, it's because he gets the characteristics of the original person that had the name. So in this case, think about this. What are the Hitlers now? In the time of Hitler, the time where he was not a genocidal dictator, Hitler must have been a normal last name, right? A German last name. I don't suppose that only Adolf Hitler had that last name. So where are the Hitlers now? You don't see a lot of Hitlers or famous Hitlers besides Adolf Hitler. You see? That means that the name Hitler has some qualities of evil. And if you receive the name Hitler or the nickname Hitler, that means that you're receiving the qualities of that name. That's why, I don't know, I suppose that a lot of people changed their names when after World War II and all of the horrible things happened. Uh, and the other question, what about the Adolfs? All right. In this one, I have personal experience. Think about my name, my second name, right? So my second name has some qualities of dictatorship, and maybe as a teacher, some of you see them, maybe you don't, but it has some inherited qualities that from the moment you're, I don't know, from childhood, they chase you because this name has inherited qualities that are so pervasive, right? My parents did not love me a lot, supposedly. So yeah, these names, Adolf and Hitler, they carry so much information, so much qualities that they can inherit those qualities to someone. You can use the name Hitler as an insult today. You can say, "Oh, what a Hitler!" You can say, if you say someone is a Hitler, that means they're a dictator, they're mean, they're evil, right? Or this person is the new Hitler, right? Because the name has qualities that can be inherited, right? And this is not only for evil. You can also inherit or pass information that is positive, and a lot of people do it when they name their children. So that's basically a name from a causal theory, all right? So we already saw the two sides. It's not that important, but at least you have a better understanding now of those two sides. The description theory and the causal theory. All right. Any questions? So I'm gonna move the slide right now. But if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat section. Okay. As for nouns and noun phrases, I did not, or I don't plan on spending too much time on them because understanding this is kind of easy. So we're just gonna, I don't know, read again this part of the text. It says nouns and noun phrases can be used to refer indefinite and definite noun phrases. This means noun phrases can operate like names to pick out an individual. For example, I spoke to a woman or the woman, right? These two expressions can be similar to names in the sense that they help you to identify entities in the world. That means they can be used to refer. Okay, so it says where, of course, the difference between the nominals hangs on whether the woman to whom the speaker refers is known to the listener or has been identified earlier in the conversation. So that's easy to understand. Definite noun phrases can also form definite descriptions. So definite descriptions. This will be a key word here. The referent is whoever or whatever fits the description, right? And this is related, funnily enough, to the exercise we just did about Hitler. I give you the description, and whoever fits the description, that's the referent. So if I say the dictator from the 40s that tried to take over Europe, that's a description. Who fits that description? Hitler. That means that the referent in that description is Hitler because he fits the description. But again, these descriptions are also very much variable because they can change. For example, if I say the semantics teacher, right? In this moment, there are two. One is me, myself, in the university, and another one is one of my mates, the other teacher that teaches in the night. So we can have two of those. And this is where I want to focus. This is the focus of this part at least. I want to focus on this. An account of reference has to deal with cases where there is no referent to fit the definite description. As in Bertrand Russell's famous example, the King of France is bald. Why is this concerning to this case right here? Because the King of France doesn't exist. So that means that a theory of reference has to deal with elements that don't have a referent in the world. For example, the King of France is non-existent. So how do you deal with an expression like the King of France, because the King of France does not have a referent in the world. So that's a problem for the referential theories when you have elements that do not exist in the real world. If your theory says that meaning is the entities in the world, then what about expressions like this? Here is where the conversation starts to turn to sense. For the moment, okay. So again, I'm going to stop here for just a second and let you take some notes. So I'm going to wait for, I don't know, a minute or so, and then I'll move on. All right, Nicolas, for the last example, when we talk about the King of France, we say that there is a problem in the referential theory. Remember, referential theory is or referential approach is when we say that meaning is the objects in the world, right? So there is a problem because some expressions don't have a real object in the world. For example, the King of France. There is no King of France today. As for today, there is no King of France. So this expression is very difficult to explain from a referential theory because it doesn't have an object in the world. How do you talk about an expression that doesn't have any objects in the world that represent it or that can be used as reference? That is the problem. That is a problem that is going to lead the conversation or take the conversation of meaning from reference to sense. That's what I was saying. Is it a little bit clear now? All right, man. So moving on. So we get this. Let's wait a second. Questions. Right, in the first part, could we say that A is more specific and the more general? Maria Fernanda, can you open your microphone and tell me?
Professor, I don't have very clear that part.
What part?
I spoke to a woman about the noise. I spoke to a woman about the noise. I don't.
All right. So let's take it from there. We say that. Oh, your dog is mad. All right. We say that nouns and noun phrases can be used as reference, right? So basically, a woman and the woman can be used to refer to the same thing, but it's just that one is more dependent. When we say a woman, which is indefinite, in this we mean that the person that we are talking to, that person may not know what specific woman, right? I spoke to a woman. Maybe this is less specific, and the woman is more specific. So the difference is that maybe a woman is a person that you know, or maybe you don't know. But in the woman, when you say the woman, we say the because what we mean is that it's a person that we already know. That's the difference between the and a. That when we say a, maybe it's someone that we don't know, just a person in general, or when we say the, maybe it's because we know the specific person. That's what the author says. Where of course the difference between the nominals is these two things. When he says the nominals, the difference between the nominals, he means a woman and the woman. So the difference between the nominals hangs on whether the woman to whom the speaker refers is known to the listener or has been identified earlier in the conversation. So when I say a woman, that means that the person may not be known to the listener, or maybe I haven't mentioned that person in the conversation. But if I say the woman with a definite article, that means that the listener knows the woman, or maybe I think that the listener knows the woman, or I already mentioned the person before in the conversation. That's the difference between those two things. So this one, a is less specific and the is more specific. Even if both of them refer to the same person.
Okay, Professor, thank you. Now it's clear.
Then is it clearer? Is it clearer for
Yeah.
you?
Yeah,
Yes.
it's clear now. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. All right. Let's move on. Okay, so from here, the question is very clear. Is reference all of meaning? So remember, for the referential theory, meaning is the objects in the world. But is reference, the question is reference all of meaning? Is reference only objects in the world? That's the problem and that's the question. And many linguists are divided in this issue. So for some linguists, reference is meaning, and for some other linguists, reference is more. Meaning is more than reference. So let's read this paragraph for the moment. It says, as we have observed, or as we observed earlier, perhaps the simplest theory of meaning is to claim that semantics is reference. That is to say, to give the meaning of a word, one shows what it denotes. To give the meaning of a word, one shows what it denotes. What this means basically is that in order to understand the meaning of a word, you have to show the object or the entity in the world that the expression is trying to connect to or it talks about. So let's continue. In its simplest form, this theory would claim that reference picks out elements in the real world. As described by Kenton, such an approach might claim the following. Proper names denote individuals. Common names denote sets of individuals. Verbs denote actions in the world. Adjectives denote properties of individuals. Adverbs denote properties of actions, right? This will be from a referential approach to meaning, right? But the question is still this one. Is it like that? Is it like that? The answer for many linguists is no. Is reference all of meaning? No. This is what some people believe, but this has many, many problems. And I'm going to show you at least one of those problems by using an example from another linguist that has a more, I don't know, sarcastic view of this issue right here. By the way, this element, this part right here is in the copies. Let me see for just a second where it is. I don't remember. Okay, it's in page 29. If you have your document there, it's in page 29, where it says reference as a theory of meaning. So that's for you to find it. Okay, so again, you have that in page 29 for you to find it. So let's move on for just a second. So this is the problem that I was talking to you about. Noun phrases with no referent, a problem for the referential theory. So the question is, if meaning is reference, what is the meaning of Santa Claus? A very simple question. If meaning is reference, what is the meaning of Santa Claus? And this is a question that basically kind of kills or defeats the purpose of the referential theory. At least this question makes us think or makes us believe that meaning is much more than just reference. Meaning is much more than just entities in the world. That's what I'm trying to say with this question. Because Santa Claus is an imaginary character. He doesn't exist, right? Anyone that dresses like Santa Claus is just a person dressed as Santa Claus, but not the real Santa Claus. So, if meaning is objects in the world, then what is the meaning of Santa Claus? That's the problem. And that's the problem that a lot of linguists see in the referential theory, and that's why they try to move on to other elements in meaning. Okay? From here, is it understandable what I'm trying to say? Do you have any questions so far? Nope, not so far. Okay, so let me move on to the next slide where I'm going to show you the opinion from a linguist and what he thinks about this problem. All right, so the name of the linguist is Paul Elborn, taken from a book, or from his book, called Meaning as Link Guide to Semantics, right? I'm gonna read this and at the same time give you time to read it too. So let's begin reading from here. That even if we grant referential theorists the existence of Santa Claus, and he says, which is surely about the most generous intellectual concession that one could ever make, problems still abound here. So there are still many problems with the referential theory. And when the non-existence of Santa Claus poses, this is kind of important. When the non-existence of Santa Claus poses a problem for your theory, it is time to look for a new theory. So he's a little bit more aggressive with his opinion, a little bit more sarcastic, but he makes a really good point, which is that if the referential theory of meaning says that meanings are objects in the world, what happens with expressions like unicorns, dragons? I don't know. What about characters from books? For example, I don't know, The Lord of the Rings, which is something that I like. What about characters like Gandalf or Aragorn, etc.? Those characters, I can think about those characters. I know I can give you some descriptions of the characters, but they don't exist. So what is the meaning of Gandalf? What is the meaning of, I don't know, Smeagol, right? If those elements don't have objects in the world to represent them, right? So then he says, so let us move on. Let us move on then to examine the internalist theory. And internalist is basically another name for representational. Don't get confused here. He says this theory states that word meanings are internal mental structures. Internal mental structures. The basic idea can also be expressed by saying that meanings are ideas or concepts. So ideas or concepts. Or by saying that meanings are in the head. My meanings are in the head. Some version of the theory goes back at least to Aristotle, who in his treatise on interpretation wrote, spoken words are symbols of mental experiences. So you see, that's why I told you that the discussions in semantics are sometimes very philosophical, and that the problem of meaning goes back even to those times of the first famous philosophers. Mental experiences. Okay, so theory was prominent in the Middle Ages. This is not so important. Continues with his ideas there. So as you can see, there is more. There is much more to meaning than just reference. That's something that I want to be very clear for you. Up to this point, any questions? Anyways, I'm going to give you a minute or two to take notes about this, because this is a document that you don't have. So I'm going to leave the slide there for a second, wait a minute. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat section. Okay, so a minute more or less has passed. So as I see, there are no questions so far. I hope that this is clear to this point. So let's move on.
Professor.
Yes.
So no real things can have meaning, or I don't know, by themselves, just by the ideas that we have.
Repeat.
No real things can have meaning, or meaning, just by the ideas that we have.
Okay,
by themselves, meaning by themselves.
They do have meaning. Expressions that don't have objects in the world, they do have meaning. The problem is the theory from which we analyze it. If we analyze it from the referential theory, and the referential theory says that meanings are objects in the world, then it's very difficult to analyze expressions that don't have a referent in the world.
So in that sense, they don't have meaning.
From the referential theory, that's difficult.
No. Okay.
So that's why we have to move past referential meanings. We have to move from referential to more representational or internal approaches to meaning.
Okay, thank you.
So again, it's not that, what I'm saying is not that expressions without referent don't have meaning. I'm saying that it's difficult to explain the meaning of those expressions from referential theory. From referential theory, it's difficult to explain those expressions. Nicholas Berry, Christian Bishop, who gave gifts in the past, and not precisely an imaginary figure. Okay, that can be an explanation, but it doesn't account for the fact that there is a mythology for Santa Claus. For example, in the United, when you hear the name Santa Claus as a child, the first things you learn as a child is that he's a magical being that lives in the North Pole, and that he flies in this magic sled with some reindeers, and he goes down your chimney and leaves gifts in your house for if you've been good, right? That's the element that I'm trying to talk about. You can track the origin of Santa Claus to a real person in the world, but that doesn't mean that when people say the word Saint Santa Claus, they refer to that person. So that's a problem. So again, the problem persists. Understood? Great. So moving on. Okay, so the answer is that there is more to meaning than reference. Okay, and okay, not to read all of that. That section that is being displayed there is on page 30, right? The last paragraph on page 30. If you have the document there, you can go to that section. All right, so let's read it slowly so we get those concepts back. It says, if we can understand and use expressions that do not have a real world referent, and we can use different expressions to identify the same referent, and even use two expressions without being aware that they share the same referent, then it seems likely that meaning and reference are not exactly the same thing. Or to put it another way, there is more to meaning than reference. Let's put it another way. There is more to meaning than reference, and this is the important part. How should we characterize this extra dimension? One answer is to follow Frege in distinguishing two aspects of our semantic knowledge of an expression: its sense, and here is where the conversation goes from reference to sense. Its sense and its reference. In this division, sense is primary. Sense is primary in that it allows reference. If you don't have the concepts, the internal representation of the entity, then it's very difficult for you to form a relation of reference. In that it allows reference. Continuing here, it is because we understand the expression the President of Ireland, or let's say it's Santa Claus, that we can use it to refer to a particular individual at any given time. Other ways of describing this same person will differ in sense but have the same reference. So, for example, let's take the descriptions for Hitler that I gave you in the previous examples. I gave you two descriptions, and both of those descriptions can be used to describe Hitler. But those two descriptions have very different meanings. You see, and even though those two expressions have very different meanings, they have the same referent. I mean, the same person, Hitler. That means that there is kind of a complication there, because Hitler, in that perspective, has more than one meaning. That means that the meaning of Hitler is not just the person in the world, but also the sense of Hitler. You see, that's what I'm trying to go. So expressions like dog, in the example that I gave you, dog, etc., they go beyond reference. It's not that the meaning of those expressions is not just the objects that they represent in the world, but also the different concepts and mental constructions that we have about those words. You see? That's what I'm trying to say, or that's what the conversation is trying to go here in the document. Okay, moving on for just a second. All right, so we can state that reference depends on conceptual knowledge. And when we say conceptual knowledge, well, we mean concepts. That's basically what we mean. We mean concepts, right? Mental constructions, mental frameworks. So, although these are sections of the reading, although reference is an important function of language, the evidence suggests that there must be more to meaning than simply denotation or simply objects in the world. We adopted the convention of calling this extra dimension sense. The meaning of an expression will arise both from its sense and its reference. So, this is important. I told you one time that we are not trying to solve the debate between referent and or referential theories and representational theories, right? I told you that some linguists were divided between these two, but we are not trying to solve any debate. And for some linguists, at least for some philosophers too, the meaning of an expression is a combination of the reference, that means the objects that they try to denote or connect to in the world, and also from its sense, right? From the relationships that the expression has in language. So sense, from here, sense places a new level between words and the world, the level of mental representation. So from here, the conversation moves to what is a mental representation, and the author is going to discuss that a little in the reading, but we are not going to focus so much on that, right? For the moment, we are not going to focus so much on what is a mental representation, right? What I want you to do right now is to, well, first of all, I'm gonna give some space here for questions and for doubts so far. And I want you to please go to Edmodo, to the semantics class, and I want you to please find the document that I left there, download it, and now that we have discussed these concepts here in class, we can start trying to solve the exercises and reading a little bit more, introducing ourselves to what sense is in semantics, right? And that's what I want you to do. So I'm gonna stop the class right here. I want you to please do that on Edmodo. And if you have, but I'm not going to stop the session. If you have any questions, you can formulate them and let's try to discuss them right now. What I'm going to do is stop the recording.